29 sites, 15,000 brochures. Open now to the public since Monday, August 17th. African Americans in Erie County, a trail of shared heritage, features the stories of key people and places and events throughout Erie's history and how each has contributed to the region's economic, political, and cultural history. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. In this conversation, we'll discuss the recently launched walking and driving tour with two of its founders, Dr. Chris Majok and Mr. Johnny Johnson. Now, Dr. Majok is a professor of history at Mercyhurst University. He is the founder of Mercyhurst's Public History and Museum Studies program and helped to establish Preservation Erie and served as its first president. The author of many books and articles, he is currently completing work on a post-1945 narrative history of the United States for Routledge Press. Now, Mr. Johnny Johnson has been a resident of Erie for 50 years. Mr. Johnson taught health and physical education at various middle schools and high schools in Erie's public schools for more than 30 years before retiring. He coached many athletic teams and was the first African American to coach a varsity basketball team in Erie's history. Now, he is the president of the Harry T. Burleigh Legacy Alliance, has participated in numerous historical programs, and is the author of Erie African Americans in the 1880s. Now, Chris and Johnny, along with Preservation Erie Chair Melinda Meyer, have worked with various community partners to launch this effort, what we'll talk about today. Those partners have included Mercyhurst University, the Thomas B. Hagen Department of History and Public History Program, Erie Arts and Culture, Erie Yesterday, WQLN, and the Hagen History Center. We'll discuss how this effort began, some of the people and places featured in it, what it helps to teach the community, and what lies ahead. Now, since this conversation is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening or watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us questions and we'll do our best to get them along to Dr. Majok and Mr. Johnson as best as we can. And for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Chris Majok, Mr. Johnny Johnson, thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Quite welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
So, gentlemen, I think perhaps the best place to start, as with all stories, is in, well, the beginning. So take us back to 2012. How did this effort begin?
Okay, I'll let Chris do the 2012. I'll take you beyond that. Go ahead, Chris.
Sure. The Mercyhurst Public History Program was invited to collaborate with the Edinburgh Historical Society. They received a grant from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission to do two things. One, an exhibit on Beatrice and Leroy Smith, two great African-American leaders in Edinburgh, which they did and carried out that exhibit beautifully. Second was to begin the process for establishing a county-wide trail of sites connecting as many as possible of the stories and events and key figures of African-American history throughout Northwest Pennsylvania. We had a student, a remarkable student, Adriana Hausman, who worked with Johnny and with other African-American community historians, worked from the Journey from Jerusalem book, which was written 25 years ago by Sarah Thompson, Karen James. So Adriana drew from those resources, from Johnny and from that book, and did a really nice job in drafting, essentially producing a draft of what you now see on the screen. The trail didn't move forward a whole lot for a few years. It kind of languished. We all had other things to do in our lives, and then we revived it a couple of years ago. I was able to secure a grant from Erie Arts and Culture, and Sarah, Johnny, Melinda, and I began meeting and working. I had some students, again, some great students working on this over the last year or so. And so the end result is the brochure as well as the website. Johnny, however, can tell you about the deeper history that precedes that 2012 moment.
Hey, thank you, Chris. To get anywhere, if you're in a hotel, you start on the bottom floor and you take the elevator to the top. So I'm going to start on the bottom floor right now. In 1994, the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission came to Erie to do an annual Black History Conference. And this is where all this genesis about Black history in Erie began. Okay, we go from 1994 and we look at what Sarah and Karen James did with the first cumulative history of African American in Erie County. If we move from there, we move to the Erie Historical Society in 2009, did what we call a ethnic Erie affair that dealt with Black history or African American history in Erie. The community got together and we had about 2 or 3 weeks or maybe a month of just people coming into the historical society to look at the accumulated Black history that had come from the community. So that was the genesis of where all of this came from. And we started on the bottom floor and now we are flying up to the penthouse, I hope.
So on the way to the penthouse, Johnny, I've got to ask you, what called you specifically, personally, professionally? What called you to this effort, this project, and to really push it across the finish line or from the ground floor on the way to the penthouse?
Well, you know, I'm a product of the 70s band, and I remember a song that someone used to sing is that I don't mean to cause any fuss, but what about us? Okay, so my time being here in Erie when I first came, there wasn't really anything that led me to understand what the African American community was, what it had done, the important people in the community. And during my teaching tenure, I met Mrs. Earl Lawrence, who was the guru of African American history here in Erie. And I became a protege of hers, and I would visit her house, and the accumulated history that she had about her family from the 1800s to the time that she was there was just extraordinary. And that gave me the passion to say, hey, if we have all this information about who and what we were, then why can't we get this information out to people who needs to know this?
Thank you, Johnny. I know you took us to the prehistory history, and Chris, I started with you in 2012. And so I want to take a look briefly, and I know we don't have time to get through each one of the 29 sites,
Right.
although we are going to talk about some of the people and some of the places as we go along. But I've got to ask you again, a beginning question. How did you choose where to start? There had to be a first spot that you started researching, paying attention to, developing, and then built it out from there. At least I imagine that's how this began. So where did you get started in putting these 29 sites together?
Well, I would just say a couple things, and Johnny can jump in. I mean, you begin at the beginning, and you know the familiar history of Northwest Pennsylvania, of Erie, the Pennsylvania Population Company cutting this maritime, ultimately industrial, thriving village on the lake shore, and turning it into this burgeoning, incredible industrial economy by the mid-19th century. Right? That's the familiar story. It has largely been a white dominant story. There were, of course, native peoples here, and they usually get a kind of a footnote in the story. African Americans, however, have been here from the very beginning of European white settlement, from the 1790s. So that's where we began. The Gospel Hill Cemetery is one such site. Bladen Road is another site. There are multiple sites that connect to the history of slavery under our very feet. I mean, it's just a remarkable thing to understand that enslaved persons helped to build the wealth of this region, and their ancestors continue to walk among us, you know? So that's where we began. And we had 22 sites, again, from slavery ultimately to roughly the civil rights era. And then when there was a story in the Erie Times when this got revived 3-4 years ago, and I got a couple of phone calls, one of which was from Marjorie Warner, who had a deep family history at another site. And we added that site, Reed's Corners, an extraordinary building, just architecturally speaking, Italianate revival, 1855. Her great-great-grandfather, Orrin Reed, was involved in the Underground Railroad. So that was one of the 7 sites that we ended up adding to make it ultimately 29.
One of the things I'll get to later and ask about is, you know, are there more? How are you working? What's the next steps? But I don't want to rush that process. Johnny, any comments for you before we move in and start looking at the people and places in the context that set this up?
Yeah, you know, we have to give a great deal of homage to Sarah Thompson and also to Karen James.
Yes.
Without the research that they did, we would not have the brochure or any sites that are on there. So I'm a firm believer in giving credit to whom credit is due. And they were, if I would call them, the pace setters in doing what you see today.
Well, so a big thanks to them and a big thanks to you. And what a tremendous brochure. I know the font is small here in this presentation, but we're going to get to where people can find this brochure or find one of the copies that are physically now distributed throughout Erie, 15,000 of them, but also a website. But I want to really start with how this aligns with a national conversation that we're having right now and the history of slavery and coming to terms with that and making sure that it's not an ignored portion of our history or an edited out portion of our history or an edited portion of our history in the struggle for freedom. What do we find in Erie when we find the history of slavery and the struggle for freedom? What might we have not known or what might not have been taught to us that we're now learning through this heritage tour?
Well, I think among other things, we find that some of the biggest, most important names in early Erie history brought human property to this region. Kelso, PSV Hammett, Reed, out in Harbor Creek, Thomas Reese, a surveyor with the Pennsylvania Population Company, big names. John Grubb Road, right? Brought a man named Bo Bladen, who turns out to be a former slave from Guinea, West Africa. More recently, he was in Maryland. Grubb brings him here, and Grubb ultimately becomes a champion, or maybe that may be an overstatement, but a supporter of abolition, an outspoken one later on in his life. And at some point, some of this is murky in terms of how well it's documented, but we do know that Bladen earns his freedom and 400 acres of land, most of which is held onto by his sons for the better part of the next century. Here's an African American who becomes one of the largest early landowners in Erie County in 1795, 96, somewhere in there. And that land, portions of it, I mean, it got shrunk down over the course of that century, but parcels of it held in that family for a century. You can go out to the Gospel Hill Cemetery, which is just a lovely contemplative site overall, and you will find the stories of Robert McConnell and James Titus, African Americans brought here by Thomas Reese, some of the first blacks in Harbor Creek. And Harbor Creek ends up with the largest concentrated population of African Americans early on in the 19th century. And right alongside their graves, you have 183 largely unmarked graves, but now at least identified through remote sensing done by the Mercyhurst Archaeological Program about 15 years ago. And there's a nice historical marker there. Those 183 graves are those of children and freed persons, and we suspect some enslaved persons as well. So, I mean, the history is right under our feet, the history of slavery, as well as the struggle for freedom, which we'll see in some of the next slides.
So Johnny, sorry, go ahead, Johnny.
That's okay. Also being, you may ask the question, it's 2020 now. How could these significant things be left out of Erie history from 1795 to 2020? What motivation was there to say that, hey, this is a one-sided picture that we're going to show, and it's a picture that only we can see or we want to see. I think one thing that is significant about what this brochure does, it reveals the truth. And a lot of times the truth is hard for people to understand. Were there blacks in Erie doing a lot of great things in 1795 or whatever? Yes, there were. So why do young people today, both white and black, don't know about this, and now it's 2020? Those are questions that need to be answered, and those are things that need to be looked into.
And Johnny, with that, were those questions that you were hearing people ask before this, or were these questions that you thought need to be asked, and then now this heritage tour helps people begin to ask and learn? That is, were you responding to the community in a way, or are you leading the community? The community didn't know the questions it needed to be asking.
Well, actually, Ben, I was doing both. Okay, you know, life is about passion, and when you have passion, especially for things that would enhance, educate, and enlighten people, you just like that train. You just keep pushing and you keep moving. And it's in me to keep pushing and moving because people need to know things that will enhance for America to become a better place, not just Erie, but for America to become a better place for all of us.
I appreciate that. And moving us along and moving the presentation along, I want to get into the people and places that we find and touch upon some of them. And so, Chris, I want to pitch it over to you. What do we learn in the tour about Albert Vosburgh and Hamilton Waters, two men that we find, two individuals that we find in this tour? What do we learn here?
Well, we learned that Albert Vosburgh arrives in Erie in the early 19th century, somewhere about 1818, and he establishes a barber shop at 314 French Street, and he, working with Hamilton Waters, who was himself a former slave who purchased his freedom. Johnny can tell you more about him. He was partly blind. There's some speculation, I think informed speculation, that he was partly blind by way of a beating suffered at the hands of his former master for the crime of learning how to read. But Waters worked with Vosburgh in outfitting runaway enslaved persons who were making their way ultimately to freedom. Vosburgh would give them a shave and a haircut, sometimes dye their hair. Waters would press clothes and dry clean the clothes and put a new suit of clothes on these usually young men and women and send them on their way. Hamilton Waters often escorting them out to Wesleyville at the Methodist Church. He would connect with Frank Henry, who often hid runaway fugitives in the belfry of the Wesleyville Methodist Church, which sat on Buffalo Road, right near the current site of the train shop, if you can imagine that, on Wesleyville and Buffalo Road, right downtown there. So Vosburgh, and then he dies in 1846. His son Robert carries on that work. Actually, I have it backwards. It was Robert who was the father. Albert is the son, and he carries on the work of the father, Robert, in the 1850s, when the fugitive slave runaway Underground Railroad work continued.
And Johnny, give us a little bit more on Hamilton Waters, his importance to this tour, his importance to Erie history.
Well, Hamilton Waters was a very unique individual. He was enslaved in the state of Maryland, worked for his master, and I'm assuming he was able to go out and make money. And significant thing is that he bought his mother's freedom. And when he bought his mother's freedom, they got in a wagon train or whatever and began to leave Maryland searching for a place. Erie was not the place that they were going to. They were going to Detroit. They were going to Michigan. But his wife was pregnant, and she had the baby on the way, and they decided to stay here in Erie. And that was great for Erie because from Hamilton Waters came one of the most well-known people in Erie history, which is Harry T. Burleigh. Okay, so he played an important part in what Erie history is all about. And through his progenitors, through his grandson, Harry T. Burleigh, Erie became a place well-known, very well-known.
I just have to inject the great story I love about Waters is that his two jobs. He was the town crier in Erie and the lamplighter, like going up and down the streets of Erie, lighting the gas lamps. And he would take his grandson, Harry T. Burleigh, with him. And as he was walking, he would sing the old plantation spirituals of his enslaved youth. And it was from that moment, right, that Harry T. Burleigh, the grandson, gets full of the spirit of that music and goes on to become one of the great singers internationally. by 1920. And again, one of Erie's great citizens ever.
Right, and if I also may add, Ben, we left out Lisa Gittimer and also Charles Kennedy. I don't know if you have the DVD of Safe Harbor, but the Safe Harbor DVD actually brought all of the Underground Railroad in Erie and in northwestern Pennsylvania into focus. And I would advise anybody, I think the public library has that. I have some copies. Just look through or just view the DVD Safe Harbor. It's really great about the history of northwestern Pennsylvania and Erie.
I appreciate that, Johnny, and it's a great opportunity to look at a name familiar to Erie here with Harry T. Burleigh, but then also look at names that are less familiar to us, Vosburgh and Waters, but then to also look at the places that we see along the way in this tour. And so take us to the St. James AME Church, which happens to be Erie's oldest African-American church and the first meeting place for the NAACP at the turn of the 20th century. Johnny, tell us about the history here.
Well, one of the things about Blacks, when they moved to an area, religion was very important to them, and so they wanted to found a church. So St. James AME Church was founded, and it was founded by some of the very first people who came here to Erie. I don't have a list of the founders with me, but if we could go back into the census of the early 1800s, we would find those people's names. It was a meeting place for Blacks where they could congregate and worship, and not only congregate and worship, but with the NAACP meeting there to formulate a plan or to formulate plans for the empowerment or the betterment of Blacks within the city of Erie.
In another common place known to Erie, the Booker T. Washington Center, we also see that. Could you gentlemen speak to that and the rise of that in the 1930s?
Well, everybody needs a place for not only recreation, they need a place to become who they should become. The Booker T. Washington Center was a place where Black people in Erie could go, learn how to sew, learn how to sing, learn how to do those things that make up a community and enhances a community. And it was the first place that Blacks could go and call a place their own. The Booker T. Washington Center, if you look at that picture, you can see Earl Lawrence there. Earl Lawrence had a band at the Booker T. Washington Center. He also had a choir. So it was a coming together place for those people in Erie to look for oneness, if I could use that word.
I appreciate that word, Johnny. So I'm going to move us along and take a look at some other people that are involved here. I want to learn about John Hicks, and because we're looking at entrepreneurs too, we see that along the tour and the importance of Black entrepreneurs in Erie's history. Who is John Hicks? Teach us about him, please.
Chris, you take John.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating story, the whole history of African Americans and ice cream making in Erie has a deep history, goes into the early 19th century. John Hicks, by the end of the 19th century, was one of the kings of the ice cream business in Erie, a wholesale producer as well as retail from his business and home there on State Street, which he built himself, as I recall, right, Johnny? I mean, he erected that structure himself, hugely successful, so much so that he becomes a kind of a center for finance of capital lending for the Black community, he and Vosburgh as well. So a hugely significant figure, entrepreneurially figured out certain kind of techniques in making ice cream that were different from other makers, and sold his ice cream far and wide, well beyond Erie.
And if I may add also, John Hicks was a political figure in Erie during his time, a Republican, a very political figure. Also, he was very instrumental in the Masonic Lodge here in Erie. Yeah. In fact, he was I forget the name of the head of the Mason, because I'm not a Mason, but he was the head, and he even did the keynote speech in Pittsburgh at one of the Masonic conferences. So he was just what I call a person that you could just look into and just look and see their character, look and see their intelligence, and just look and see what type of person he really was.
That photograph really speaks well of exactly what you're describing. I mean, he was somebody.
Well, in addition to Hicks, we see early on actually Erie's first business in the city owned by an African-American woman. And we've heard the name Lawrence once already, but tell us a bit about Emma Gertrude Lawrence.
This is yours, Johnny.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Emma Gertrude Lawrence came to Erie from Buffalo. She was in an adopted family. She came here. She married John Lawrence, who was I don't want to say butler, but he was a doorman at the Lawrence Hotel. He passed away in 1884, and she was left with children to fend for. And the story says that she began to do washing or whatever, and she was very good at it. And there were some people who thought that she should go into business. And she established, with help, the Lawrence Dyeing and Cleaning Service. And that held true in Erie to the late 1950s or the early 1960s. When she passed away, it was taken over by her son, Charles Lawrence. And it was just something for that time to see a Black female with a business. And not only a Black female with a business, but with the wherewithal to know that she had to do something to take care of a family that she had no husband there for. And it's just a story of ingenuity. It's a story of guts and grits, if I could use those two words.
And if I can
just add, I mean, it's a reminder of what great American stories all of these are, right? Guts and grit and courage and heroism and the stories of the people involved in the Underground Railroad. Just take them as one great example as a group. I mean, the courage of Black and white folk, you know, working together to win others' freedom. The empathy, right, that is imbued in that story is remarkable and so important, right, for us to kind of remind ourselves in our own time here.
Well, Chris, I think you were reading my mind, because I wanted to ask, in your research, the two of you and others, as you're working on this, I can't help but wonder what the community reaction was like to these entrepreneurs. Were people supportive? Were there challenges that we might expect coming from minority-owned minority entrepreneurs facing at that time? How did Erie react? What was the community like at this point, Johnny?
The community in Erie during that time, and I'm going to digress for a moment, okay? So when you had John Hicks and you had the Lawrence family and others in Erie, you had a very minute population of Blacks during that time, okay? So they lived in white community, they were accepted by white people, etc. So their businesses were tended, a lot of their business were white people because of the lower number of African Americans during that time. Okay, so when we look at migration, we look at now African Americans coming to Erie, which raises the number of Blacks in Erie, and with that raises the temperament of how Blacks are looked at or how Blacks are treated now in Erie. Okay, so I'm familiar with John Hicks, I'm familiar with Earl Lawrence or whatever, but I'm not familiar with Joe Smith from Laurel, Mississippi. I'm not familiar with Chris Majok from Birmingham, Alabama. So here we have what, to me, is the microcosm of what America think it isn't, but it was. The same prejudice, the same racism that was in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, was also the same flow that came to Erie during the Great Migration.
Can I add just a real quick, one of my favorite stories that I discovered, I didn't discover it, I mean, I encountered it in this project. 1858, Frederick Douglass comes to Erie. He's brought here by Henry Catlin. Henry Catlin was the publisher of a newspaper called The True American. That newspaper was published in the Lowry building, which was, I think, at 5th and French. And that building was owned by a guy named Morrow B. Lowry, who was a merchandiser, businessman, and an abolitionist, friend of John Brown, who was one of the champions of funding the 83rd Pennsylvania Strong Vincent's regiment that fought so bravely at Little Round Top and Gettysburg. He also helped to fund the Pennsylvania, he was state legislator. He was in fact known as the moral conscience of the state Senate for a couple of decades. He represented Northwest Pennsylvania. His efforts helped lead to the establishment of the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home in the years after the Civil War. Back to 1858. When Frederick Douglass comes here, he and Catlin, Douglass was going to give a speech it was called Unity of the Human Race. It was an address that he gave in a number of urban areas around the country. And he and Catlin were almost chased out of Erie by an angry mob. He barely was able to get into Park Hall. And I don't even know the location of Park Hall, where that stood in Erie, but they barely were able to get him into the building to deliver that address. And probably just barely escaped getting out of town. So a fairly hostile environment, or at least that portion of Erie that was hostile expressed themselves in rage in not welcoming Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist.
Chris, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's an important part of the history that we need to acknowledge as well, is that, while these are trailblazers, and we're looking at Erie's trailblazers, the challenges and the obstacles they faced and the pushback from the community at that time, I think is important to note. I want to keep us in the Lawrence theme, and I want to talk about a man for all seasons. We learn about him in this tour. He's an extraordinary musician, a composer, music educator, community activist, and this plays to my heart as a newspaper editor as well, a newspaper editor. So this is truly a man for all seasons, somebody that perhaps, again, some names we might be more familiar with on this tour than others. But what new do we find? What important do we find on this tour about Earl Lawrence?
If I could just speak first, Chris, and I'm gonna let Chris go. When you look at Earl Lawrence, some names come up: Adam Clayton Powell, even Martin Luther King. Because in his time and era, Earl Lawrence was the epitome of what civil rights and equal rights was all about. And just think of a man who's this talented in music, plays any instrument, okay? And not only that, but has the wherewithal to understand what's going on in his community, in the state, and around the world. I don't know whether Erie would never give enough credit. I love Harry T. Burleigh, but I don't know if Erie would ever give enough credit to Earl Lawrence.
Really an amazing figure. I mean, he taught generations of Erie kids multiple instruments. He taught kids in multiple school districts in this region, had his own music studio. He believed in the power of music to bridge the divide between races, among cultures. He often, didn't he not, Johnny, perform like with the Finnish Music Society and with the B'nai B'rith, in the Jewish American community here. I mean, he was a bridge builder. He was like Harry T. Burleigh in that respect, and in fact welcomed Harry T. Burleigh right to the Lawrence home when Burleigh came back to Erie.
And if I may add, when you look at a person like Earl Lawrence, highly educated, highly intelligent, very intellectual. And when you look at the history that was written in Erie by white historians from the 50s to the 70s, there's not one mention of Earl Lawrence. How can you not mention a man that had his own music studio, had his own bands, played at the Copper Club, played for white audience, taught some of the greatest white musicians during that time How can this man be left out of the historical record of Erie, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, he was also the director of the WPA's
Yes, he
music
was.
program, right?
Yeah.
During the New Deal era of
Yeah.
Franklin Roosevelt, and then names his newspaper the New Deal and published that newspaper on all kinds of topics that are hauntingly still relevant, you know, including the flying of the Confederate flag. He wrote about that, the lack of voting rights, the need to address poverty in both the Black and white community. There on the cover of this issue, November 1933, I don't know if you can read that ace there. That's public health. He is concerned with public health. My God, here we are. You know, a man of his time and ahead of his time.
Right.
And at the bottom of that card, you see disease prevention with public health. So he's thinking of that.
Yeah.
What I'm certainly hearing here is, gentlemen, we've got to bring you back, others back, to have a program specifically on Lawrence, to learn more about the life of Earl Lawrence. And I think this is the beauty of this heritage tour that you've created and now is underway, is that people are learning that history. We are making sure that he is not just folded in, but really considered part of our full story, our history here in Erie. Before we leave the Lawrences, I do want to go to the former Lawrence house, the family home. Johnny, what do we find there on this tour?
I visited that home many times, Ben, and there was a piano that sat in the living room that Burleigh used to play when he would come and visit the Lawrence home. He loved Ada. He would come and give Ada's gift, books, etc., and so on and so forth. And with my association with Ada, one of the stories that she told that will always be a part of my memory of Ada is that she told me that whenever Burleigh came to visit her father, her mother, whatever, that before he would leave, that he would kneel on the steps and offer up a prayer.
Oh my God.
And think about the impact that has on a 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old female living in Erie, Pennsylvania, with probably the greatest man that is known during that time, visiting her home and offering a prayer on the steps of her house for her family. I mean, you can't.
I mean, that's a man that performed for King Edward, you know, like he performed in the most prestigious venues throughout Europe, throughout the United States. That is so moving.
I think this is a simple yet profound question coming in from our audience as we're having this program live on Facebook right now, and we've got folks watching along. Simple but profound. How did we leave this guy out? How was he left out of Erie history? Of all the things we just went over, this seems to be one of the most remarkable people in our history that we should have been learning more about and we should have been celebrating. How was he left out of this story?
How was he left out of this story? I want to take a few seconds because I want to get my thoughts together.
It's a heavy answer, I know.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important question that we just have to ask. How did we do that?
The term systemic racism has been bandied about quite a bit in the last few months, and there are all kinds of ways to think about that term. Structural racism, built into the systems of this country in all kinds of ways. And sometimes it's willful and deliberate and malevolent, and sometimes it's just benign neglect. It is wrong no matter how it has played out in our history, whether it's redlining, purposeful redlining to keep blacks out of white, only communities, or whether it's, we're just accustomed to writing whites only history. And so, right, Earl Lawrence, we have the blinders on and we don't think about black folk as being embedded and so critical to our cultural life.
Well, Ben, let me say this. Earl Lawrence was not an outsider. Earl Lawrence was an Erie native. Earl Lawrence grew up and was associated with some of the top flight white people in Erie and Erie County. So you tell me how this association with some of the most well-known power people in Erie City and Erie County would leave out a person of Earl Lawrence status. we're talking about systemic racism, and we're also talking about role models. And I'm gonna get into this for a moment, okay? You know, we talk about schools and we talk about teachers, we talk about Black teachers, we talk about we need somebody within the classroom so the kids can relate to. Do you know that as well as Earl Lawrence played instruments, Earl Lawrence was not hired as a music teacher in the city of Erie. Earl Lawrence was hired as a music teacher out in the county. So I need somebody to explain that to me.
Yeah.
If anybody could do that, I'm more than willing to hear that.
Well, I think it's very telling of how we tell our history, how we've selected it. And those who hold the pens have not wanted to loosen their tight grip on it, to allow others to share in that storytelling. And Chris, I think you put it poignantly of whether it's benign, if we just have our blinders on, and because we're not looking to include other people that look different than us, think different than us, have different backgrounds than us. If we are the pen holders, we don't include them. Or if it's an active disassociation from our own history to not incorporate that, either way, it's wrong. But I want to move us along on the tour, and from Front Street, we head down to Walnut Street. Chris, tell us a little bit about what we find down there with the Reverend Ernest Franklin Smith's Good Samaritan AME, Zion Church, and in the, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, that's fine. You know, tragically, what we find there today is not the building, you know, and that's the case with many of the sites on this tour, many of the actual structures. I don't know about many, but quite a few, you know, of the 29 are not there. You know, the sites are embedded with the stories, but that again underscores the need for better historic preservation in this region. But that aside, Reverend Ernest Franklin Smith is a remarkable figure. He gets to Erie in 1934, arrives from Mississippi, and he establishes a pipeline from the region surrounding Laurel, Mississippi in particular, straight to Erie. He took several, you know, I don't know what the number is, how many recruiting missions down to Laurel, Mississippi, ultimately putting, you know, his life in danger because the Southern planter aristocracy actually testified in Congress warning about the theft of their labor force from the plantation fields of the South. This kind of stuff was dangerous. I mean, this is at a time of, you know, we're lynching Black folk, you know, in the South, not only Jim Crow, but lynching Black men for crimes far less than this. And so every time he goes down there, he's bringing Black folk back up to Erie. And he established, I didn't mention, right, the Good Samaritan AME Zion Church and the Negro Welfare Mission. So once Black folk arrive here, you can find all kinds of services there. He's doing a nursery school. He's feeding hungry children. He's teaching adult education. He worked to improve sanitary conditions, public health, not only in the Black community, but throughout the more economically distressed neighborhoods of Erie. Again, an amazing guy. He ends up making a good friendship with H.O. Hurt of Erie insurance fame, right? And he, together with Hurt, they end up establishing the first nursing program for Black women to become nurses in the city of Erie. An amazing guy, and his legacy lives on to this day. Gary Horton is the director of the E.F. Smith Quality of Life Learning Center, and they do much of the same kind of work, very much with the spirit of E.F. Smith.
Well, I think that what we see, you know, of being great weight here in Erie's role in it and an Erie person's role in it is that troubling clause that we see in the 13th Amendment that folks are free now, except if you are a criminal. And we see the criminalization of that. But to put himself in harm's way and to risk that and to work to bring people to Erie, yeah. My gosh, what a heavy part of this tour and what a significant part of this tour we encounter.
And one last footnote, by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, you know, I mean, roughly now, contemporary Erie, what is it, Johnny? I mean, we have the population of the city, African-American, it's about 50%, roughly 50% of the Black community in Erie can trace their lineage back to the region around Laurel, Mississippi, many of them coming from Oak Park High School there.
That's just,
and you know,
Johnny, please.
Yeah, one of the things that I would like to add is that E.F. Smith was also an author. He also had a newspaper. We have a copy of that newspaper. And I'm hoping later on, and Chris and I will talk about this, we're hoping later on our website for people to read the newspaper of E.F. Franklin, of Earl Lawrence, to see the thought patterns of people from that area, what the thought patterns were, how they saw things, how they believed things. I'm a firm believer that we can't change the future unless we understand what transpired in the past. And reading some of these things will give us a general insight as to what these people thought, what their visions were.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the important thing there, Johnny, that I think of, as somebody who, is still involved in newspapers, is just having access to that in the archives and to be able to reference that in Erie's history of the newspapers that it's had and be aware of that, have it there as source material, have it there as historical material. I think that's incredibly significant. I feel like we could spend an entire hour just on this one spot, this one site on the tour, but I'm going to move us along. Johnny, I want you to tell us what we find on the tour at the Bayview Park, our Pontiac field. What do we find here?
What do we find at Bayview Park? There was a friend of mine who taught with the first Black teacher at McDowell High School, Larry Moore, who was a historian also. And in 1994, he wrote for the Erie Journal Studies the history of the Erie only Black team, the Erie Pontiacs. I was fortunate enough to be a good friend of Larry, got a chance to talk to him, read the book, and so on and so forth. And here again, I want to talk about passion. I want to talk about the point is that here's something that happened very significant in the Black community, not only in the Black community, but also in the white community. And it wasn't even a footnote, it wasn't even a mark. So myself, Fred Rush, and some more in the community, we got together and said, look here, we need to honor these men from Erie who were very instrumental in forming this baseball team, and also not only that, but making this Erie baseball team. If you know anything in the history of Pontiac, you had just as many white people going to see the Erie Pontiacs as you had Blacks. So, this is an Erie story. We don't want the Erie story. We want somebody else's story. This is the Erie story that we need.
Well, and so was the Pope Hotel, the legendary Pope Hotel, with the floor show and the chorus line and the visiting entertainers, including Duke Ellington and, oh my God, all kinds of incredible performers. Pearl Bailey, Jackie Wilson, some of the great musicians and singers of the 50s and 60s who couldn't have stayed in most other white-owned hotels in the city of Erie in those years. Just couldn't.
Well, and I think what we see here in the tour is we see the diversity of really what's happening culturally and historically for Erie. We see educators, we see entertainers, we see athletes. We see so much that we can learn through these 29 stops. And again, I said, I know we can't get to all of them. And I feel like each one of them we can spend an hour discussing. And maybe that's something we can do in the future. We could find a way to do that and continue to have these conversations. And of course, I want to encourage people to be able to go and do this walking tour or do this driving tour and get this information. We're going to get to where people can find out more information about that. But I want to bring us as close to modern history as I think we can in satisfying this one conversation as we look at this. And Chris, so I want to turn to you here because as we are living through 2020 and we're thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement and we're thinking about what's happening culturally, a lot of comparisons are being made to the 60s. And so we're looking at particular years in the 60s. Here, one of our scholars in residence, Dr. Andrew Roth, is focused on 1968 and some of his work. But we're looking at that entire era. And so, as we talk about that and revisit that nationally and have that conversation, what is the civil rights era looking like for Erie, Pennsylvania?
There was a vibrant and robust NAACP in Erie, and they advanced multiple strategies: peaceful protests, peaceful demonstrations. They also did test cases where you'd have, for example, from our oral history, Oh my gosh, Johnny, our senior oral historian.
Celestine Davis. Celestine.
Celestine Bell Davis told the story of how she and Kate Busick, a Jewish American board member of the local NAACP, they went into a famous and beloved Erie restaurant, and Celestine went in first, and she sat there and didn't get served. Kate Busick walks in with her husband a little while later. They got served immediately. They order the same thing. Celestine gets charged more than Kate and her husband had, that sort of stuff. I mean, highlighting the discrimination patterns in Erie, job discrimination, NAACP, very active in all kinds of ways in this area, contesting redlining, housing discrimination, job discrimination. I'm going to highlight just a couple of quick stories here. There was a bus that was organized by the NAACP to go to Selma for the final complete march from Selma to Montgomery following the John Lewis moment, the Bloody Sunday moment on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, recently celebrated in his passing, that pictured on the left there. And then the final march, Selma to Montgomery, March 21st, 1965. Ida Page, with whom I did an oral history a few years back, described being on that march, and two white folk from Erie, one of whom was a Mercyhurst professor, another a reporter with an Erie newspaper, both of them getting spat upon and beaten, physically assaulted by Klansmen along the road to Montgomery. I'm teach at Mercyhurst, so I love Sister Carolyn. She was our president back in those years, and she led a sympathy march and a homily prayer vigil on campus, and about 200 people singing "We Shall Overcome," marching out of the gates of Mercyhurst onto East 38th Street. It just warms my heart. And of course, the turbulent, difficult history of the 60s. I mean, it was all a challenge to the nation, right? All of it was a struggle, and some of it was difficult and conflict filled. And that we could not escape in Erie. And in 1968, at Academy High School, we had a student uprising that was triggered by, years and years of systemic racism, discrimination, discriminatory treatment of students by an almost entirely white employee workforce. Here's the numbers: like 1,658 employees of the Erie School District in 1968. 10 of them, that's 10, were African American. 2 teachers, right, Johnny?
Right.
2 of those 10 were teachers. So, the uprising, the details of which you can read about on the website, on the brochure, it spills out into the street, and then other schools end up getting some degree of turbulence in the weeks that followed that April 1968 uprising. It was the same day that happened. The uprising at Academy was the day of Dr. King's assassination, April 4th, 1968. And then 3 days later, April 7th, there were 1,500 that came out to Perry Square, black and white, for a vigil of mourning for the slain Dr. King. And that's what you see depicted on the left side there. So the struggle, which is not finished, quite obviously, the struggle that really was a Black Lives Matter struggle. We didn't call it that then. It was a civil rights, voting rights struggle, but ultimately it's about the value, the dignity of all of us as American citizens, and that struggle continues into 2020.
Ben, if I may just add this, we are in a rights struggle. We're not in a civil rights struggle now. We're in a rights struggle. Okay. Economic right, health right, educational right. We're in a rights struggle. Okay. So why would we want to digress when you get better when you move forward? And I'm just talking now, Ben, okay? That's what we have to look at when we look at America today. Do we want to regress? Do we want to revert back to something that we were and we did not appreciate what we were? How many people want to throw away cars and get on a horse and go to Cleveland? I don't think too many people want to do that. So why would you want to throw away all the gains that we have made to become one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, to have this what we have now, which is chaos.
Johnny and Chris, I can't sing the praises enough of this tour and what it does, and how it educates the public, how it forces us to look at a history far too long ignored, and allows us to unpack our history and deepen it, and find ways to appreciate it more fully by making sure that all voices have an opportunity to be included in this. And so, as we're nearly out of time here for this discussion, I want to ask what's next. What's next for the two of you, those you're working with on this tour? Are you looking to continue research on the 29 sites that you have and deepen that? Are you looking to add additional sites? I know this is new. This is probably not a fair question because this just launched on Monday, August 17th. But here I am asking you, what are you doing next with this? What is the community doing next with this? What comes next after this?
Well, I would say just two quick things. One is that the website, folks should check it out, sharedheritage.org. And there you will find not only the brochure, but a host of other resources. There's a narrative overview history of the county. Soon you will see Journey from Jerusalem, a PDF of the book from 1996. It'll be on the website. There are oral histories from this project that we recorded through the generous support of WQLN Media. 5 remarkable oral history interviews with Johnny and Celestine Bell Davis, Ruby Jenkins' husband, Gary Horton, and Marcus Atkinson. Just great history, life histories, much of it beginning in the South and extending to Erie. So check that out. There's other things on that website. In terms of like where we go, well, there is a conversation that has just begun now about taking some of this history and getting it out onto the street in the form of interpretive wayside markers that will more fully kind of tell the story. Everybody has seen these in other cities. We have a few nice ones down here on the Bayfront in Erie, but none to this history that will give appropriate honor and really kind of flesh out the history with some nice illustrated graphics and so on of some of the stories that we've highlighted here this afternoon. So we'll see where that goes, but that conversation is now kind of gaining steam.
Ben, if I may add in closing, I think baseball about 15 or 20 years ago had a slogan called "Catch the Fever." Okay, so what we have attempted to try to do is to get Erie County citizens to catch the fever. We want Erie County school districts to catch this fever. We want the public school system within the city of Erie to catch the fever. Okay, and you catch the fever by giving young people the opportunity to learn about people that they have never learned about before. This is a great challenge for the city of Erie, a great challenge. And I personally think that we're up to the challenge, okay? I personally think that we are.
Johnny, I'm energized. I'm excited. I think we are up to the challenge. And I think that looking at this as a generational challenge is important as well, that this is a way for everyone, from Gen A all the way up through to be able to learn. So folding it into local curriculums, making sure that, those who went through high school already aren't missing it. While they missed it, they have an opportunity to access it. But those that are going through now have an opportunity to get it as they're going through high school. Those continuing their education have access to it as well. And those adults who missed out on the opportunity of learning about the great people that we talked about, from Vosburgh to Lawrence and beyond, and all of the 29 spots and sites on this tour, we've got an opportunity for that. Dr. Chris Mazzoch, Mr. Johnny Johnson, two of the founders of African Americans in Erie County, a trail of shared heritage. Thank you so very much for your time, energy, and effort spent on this project, and thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Thank you, Ben. Thank JES for having us.
It's an honor.
Absolutely. And to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in, whether you're watching in real time or you're catching a later broadcast of this on demand. Before we break, gentlemen, Chris, you mentioned the website. Could you say it one more time? Make sure that we point people in the right direction, and then maybe give a few indications of places people can go to safely get the brochures. 15,000 copies have been distributed throughout Erie. So the website, the brochure, where do we find that? Where do we point folks?
Intermodal Center is one spot down on the bayfront. They've got a good stack of them. The library, I believe, right next door has got a good stack of them. I've got a ton of them still in my office at Mercyhurst. In the COVID world, the dissemination of the 50,000 is kind of rolling out slowly.
Right.
We want to get them out to churches and all kinds of other places, and that's going to take probably a better part of, when we'll see when we get on the other side of this pandemic, how long it will take us to get them all out there, but slowly but surely. But sharedheritage.org. Sharedheritage.org is the website. You'll find the brochure there. And you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to send them in the mail to whoever wants them. And Ben, we should get you some at the Jefferson.
Absolutely. We'd be honored to feature them at JES. We will make sure we have those available. Our doors aren't open yet to the public, but as soon as they are, we're going to have them. But we're going to go ahead and put a link to that website in the Facebook post so that folks can visit it. They can find the brochure there. That link will also be on our website for this program, where that is available at jeserie.org. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES events, as well as past programs that you can view on demand, and plenty of reading material that you can go through, please do visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for learning and listening with us.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, gentlemen.